She stood trembling at the edge of the platform, a faded bundle clutched tight in her arms, as though it held the last piece of herself. And when the tall rancher stepped forward, his hand hovering in the air to steady her, she pulled back so sharply it drew stares. Her lips barely moved, but her words cut like glass. "I'm afraid to be touched." The sound of it seemed to hush even the restless horses tied nearby, and for a moment all that existed was the hollow in her voice. He froze, every muscle still, his calloused hand sinking slowly to his side, but he did not look away from her. He studied her face, pale yet burning with a hidden fire, and then, in a tone so calm it seemed to settle the whole station, he said, "Then I'll hold your heart first." His words, unpolished and real, broke through the muttering of travelers who had begun to gather, some whispering about the strange girl with the wary eyes. She blinked rapidly, as though unsure whether he had spoken to her or to the wound inside her chest that no one else could see. The thin glove she wore, stitched long ago, the seams fraying, was tugged down tighter, as though it were armor against the world. Every motion of her body said she expected to be struck, ridiculed, or turned away. Yet he did not move closer. He simply stood beside her, creating a wall of silence so thick that the curious crowd soon drifted off, disappointed at the lack of spectacle. The rancher shifted his weight, adjusting the reins in his hand, but still kept his eyes low enough not to trap hers. He could see the way she leaned ever so slightly toward him, not in trust but in exhaustion, like a woman who had walked too far on bleeding feet and could no longer decide which way to fall. Around them, the steam engine hissed, wagons creaked, and children cried for their mothers. Yet in that moment, the world narrowed to a promise no one else heard. He turned toward the hitching post where his horse waited, then paused and glanced back over his shoulder. "You don't have to walk alone," he murmured, words so soft they might have been mistaken for prayer. Something in her eyes flickered. Not quite belief, but not disbelief either. She tightened her grip on the bundle, and though she did not step after him, she did not step away. That night, as the story traveled through whispers in town, some said it was the oddest thing they had ever seen. A cowboy who dared not touch the girl beside him, and a girl who looked as though the touch of the wind itself could shatter her. But I tell you now, it was more than oddity. It was a beginning, a promise neither of them fully understood yet, but one that would change both of their lives. And so, remember, dear listener, this tale belongs to the year 1876 in the Dakota Territory, when scars were carried like secret maps upon the skin, and when a promise, spoken in the dust of a railway station, could outlive the hands that made it. I am Elias Redfeather, and I carry this memory to you across time as it was first told to me, so that you may feel what they felt and remember what love dared to risk. She did not follow when he first turned toward his horse, and for a moment he thought she might vanish back into the shadows of the station. But when the whistle of the departing train split the air and the last passengers shuffled away, she stood still as a stone, clutching that bundle like a shield. And finally her voice came again, brittle yet laced with something that sounded like surrender. "If I walk with you, you must promise never to strike me." He stopped in his tracks, his boot scraping against the dust, and his head turned just enough to meet her eyes, eyes that carried bruises no one could see, and he said with the same steady quiet he had used before, "I'll strike only the ground with my boots, and I'll strike only fire when it's cold, but you—" He paused, letting his words settle like roots into the earth. "You I will never harm." She stared at him as though he were trying to speak a language she had forgotten. And though her body trembled, her feet began to move, one step and then another, until she stood near enough to feel the warmth of his horse's flank, but not near enough to brush against him. He untied the reins with deliberate slowness, as though giving her space to decide whether she would flee or stay, and when she remained, he lifted himself into the saddle, then leaned down, extending his hand not to grasp hers, but to let it wait in the air, an open invitation without demand. She shook her head quickly, clutching her bundle tighter, but whispered, "I'll walk beside you." And so they moved, he on horseback, she on weary feet, down the road that stretched away from the station, their shadows long in the late sun, two figures bound not by touch, but by a fragile thread of words. I have carried this image in my mind for years, for in that hour of 1876, in the Dakota Territory, it was not the clatter of hooves nor the whisper of dust that echoed loudest, but the quiet vow of a woman too afraid to be touched, and a man who swore he would hold her heart first. When the trail finally bent toward the dark outline of his cabin, she slowed, as if the very sight of shelter threatened to undo her, her breath uneven, her bundle clutched so tightly her knuckles had turned white, and he said nothing, letting the rhythm of his horse's hooves speak for him until he dismounted and tied the reins, then stepped back as though to prove the place was hers to enter before it was ever his. She hesitated at the threshold, her eyes darting to the worn porch where a rocking chair leaned sideways, to the small window glowing faintly from the fire he had banked before leaving. And she whispered as though confessing a crime, "I've stood at doors like this before, and behind them, there was pain." His chest tightened, not from anger at her words, but from sorrow at the weight she carried, and he answered gently, "Then this one will be different, for I keep no chains inside, no hands raised, only warmth enough to drive out the cold." She lingered, her feet fixed as if bound by invisible cords, until finally she lowered her bundle, set it down upon the porch boards, and asked in a trembling voice, "And if I can't be what you need?" He stepped forward, but stopped short of touching her, his hand hovering in the air like a prayer, and replied, "Then I will be what you need, and the rest we will learn together." The door creaked open with a groan, the firelight spilling across her face, and still she waited until his voice, low and steady as a hymn, gave her the strength to cross, walk in, not as one who fears, but as one who belongs. And so she did, stepping across that wooden threshold where so many before her had faltered, her shoulders shaking with both dread and the faintest trace of hope, while he followed in silence, carrying only the vow he had spoken, the vow that bound them more tightly than any touch ever could. And I tell you now as Elias Redfeather, remembering that evening of 1876, that the quiet courage of her step was louder than any storm I have ever known. Inside, the room was simple. Rough beams overhead, a table scarred by years of use, a narrow bed covered with a quilt that looked patched but cared for, and a stone hearth where flames whispered instead of roared. She stood near the door as if it might still betray her, her hands pressed flat against the wood, and he moved quietly to the fire, feeding it with 2 logs until its warmth stretched wide enough to reach her trembling frame. He didn't beckon her closer, didn't demand she sit or eat, only poured a small tin cup of water and set it on the table with slow, deliberate care. His silence not of neglect, but of respect, as if to say everything in this room is yours to claim. Nothing here is taken from you. Her eyes flicked to the quilt, then to his hands, and at last to the fire where shadows danced like old memories, and her voice came low and cracking. Every time a man brought me near a bed, it was never for rest. His jaw tightened, and for a moment the weight of his anger at what had been done to her threatened to rise. But instead he softened it into a promise, his tone steady as the ground itself. "This bed is for sleep, and nothing else. You'll close your eyes when you're ready, And if they open in fear, I'll still be here, sitting in that chair, keeping the fire alive until dawn." The cup remained untouched, but her shoulders loosened, her arms falling just enough to show that maybe, just maybe, she believed him. He lit a lantern, trimmed its flame low, and leaned back in the chair by the hearth, folding his arms not in command but in quiet guard, while she lowered herself onto the quilt, not lying flat but curling on its edge like someone still learning the shape of safety. And I tell you, as Elias Redfeather, carrying the stories of those years when silence meant survival, that night was not remembered for passion or touch, but for restraint, for the way a man's stillness built a fortress around a wounded woman's sleep, and for the way her breathing finally slowed into peace. When dawn broke, it wasn't with loud horns of the town or the heavy boots of men, but with the gentlest shift of light spilling through the cabin's single window. She stirred first, her body stiff as though bracing for a blow, and her eyes darted to the chair by the hearth where he still sat, head bowed, arms folded across his chest, the fire smoldering low but alive. He had not moved to the bed, had not touched her, had not claimed what wasn't offered. Her throat tightened because this was new, utterly new, and as she pulled the quilt closer around herself, she whispered, "You stayed all night." He blinked awake and gave the smallest nod, his voice low and unhurried. "I told you I would. I don't go back on my word." For a long moment she only stared, expecting him to ask for payment, for gratitude, for anything. But instead he rose, stretched the weariness from his shoulders, and moved to the table where he laid out a piece of bread and the last of the dried venison. "It isn't much," he said, "but it's yours before I touch a bite." Her chest ached because no one had ever offered her first place at a table before, not even her own blood. And when she reached for the bread, her hand shook so badly, he placed his palm flat on the wood instead of reaching for her, grounding the moment without brushing her skin. The silence between them was not heavy, but alive, each second proving his promise that he would hold her heart before daring to touch her body. She took a bite, chewed slowly, and whispered, "Men only ever wanted what they could take." His gaze held steady as he answered, "Then maybe it's time you meet a man who only wants what you'll give." And as I, Elias Redfeather, recall these moments passed down through whispers on the frontier, I tell you there is a power in a man who holds back, who chooses patience when others chose hunger. For such a man builds trust brick by brick until even the most broken woman dares to believe she can live again. The peace of that morning was broken by a hard rap against the door, sharp and insistent, like the echo of every demand she had spent her life running from. And she flinched so violently the bread tumbled from her hands to the floor. He was already on his feet, calm as stone, crossing the room with the measured stride of a man who had faced storms without flinching. "Stay seated," he murmured, and though his voice was steady, she could see the subtle tension in his shoulders as he pulled the door open. On the threshold stood two men from town, their boots caked with mud, their eyes carrying that familiar blend of curiosity and cruelty that had once cut her down to nothing. "She here?" one of them spat, his gaze darting past the rancher to where she sat, frozen in the chair, quilt tight around her like armor. "Town don't forget what she's done. You think hiding her in this cabin makes her any less ruined?" She nearly folded into herself, but then she heard the sound of his voice, quiet yet unyielding. "She's under my roof. That means your judgment stops at my door." The men sneered, tossing ugly words about shame and ruin, but the rancher did not raise his voice nor his fists. He simply stepped forward until the doorway belonged to him alone, broad and immovable, and said, "You've had your say. Now you'll ride on." For a tense heartbeat, they lingered, but something in his stillness made them falter. And with muttered curses, they turned back to their horses. The door shut, and she sat trembling, not from fear of them, but from the startling weight of his defense. No man had ever stood between her and the world's cruelty, and she could barely breathe when he finally turned back to her and said simply, "You don't have to fear their eyes while I'm here." Tears she had long buried welled up, not because of the insult flung at her, but because for the first time someone had blocked it from landing. And I, Elias Redfeather, tell you this truth. Sometimes the greatest proof of love is not in a kiss, not in a touch, but in the silence of a man who stands guard while the world tries to break what he has chosen to protect. That night the cabin was lit only by the glow of the small fire, shadows dancing across the walls as if to guard the confessions hovering in the air, and she sat with her knees drawn up beneath the quilt, her eyes fixed on the flickering embers, though her mind was far away in places she had never dared revisit aloud. He was by the hearth, mending the strap of his saddle with the same patience he had shown her since the day she arrived, not pushing, not prying, just steady and present like the earth itself. The silence grew heavy until finally she whispered, her voice cracking, "Do you want to know why I'm afraid?" He paused, set the leather aside, and leaned forward, not closer to cage her, but just enough to show he was listening. Her hands trembled as she clutched the quilt, words catching in her throat like thorns, but the fire seemed to push them out at last. It wasn't the whip, or the town's laughter, or even being sold like some broken thing. It was that I learned every touch came with pain, every hand only wanted to take. I don't know what it means when someone reaches for me without cruelty, and I'm afraid if I let you near, I'll break in ways I can't mend. The tears she'd buried for years fell freely now, and she hated herself for how raw her voice sounded, as though she were still that girl with no defense. For a long moment he didn't speak, didn't move, and she thought perhaps she had ruined everything with her weakness. But then his voice came low and sure, carrying no pity, only promise. "Then I won't reach for your skin. I'll reach for your soul first. You'll decide when my hands are safe, and until then, all I need is your voice, your eyes, your truth." She turned toward him, startled by the absence of demand, by the gentleness braided with strength, and for the first time her fear loosened its grip enough that she could breathe without the weight of shame pressing her down. And I, Elias Redfeather, who have carried many stories of the frontier, will tell you this. What he offered her was rarer than gold or land or cattle. It was the one thing most women of that time were never given, the right to choose how love would come to them. And in that freedom she began to glimpse a life she had never thought possible. The cabin was still except for the soft crackle of the fire, and she sat with her arms wrapped tight around herself, as if to hold all the broken pieces in place. But something in the silence between them had changed since her confession. He had gone back to stitching the leather, steady and unshaken, as though her truth had not made her smaller in his eyes, but greater, and she felt a fragile warmth pushing against the cold walls inside her chest. Her lips parted once, then closed again, fear threatening to snatch the words away. Yet when she looked at him, at the broad frame bent over the simple task, at the patience written in his face, she found enough courage to speak. If I let you sit closer, will you promise not to touch me until I say?" she whispered, every word carrying the weight of years of dread. His needle stilled, and he lifted his eyes, not with hunger but with reverence, and said quietly, "You have my word." That vow hung in the air like sacred smoke, and her heart raced with both terror and longing as she gestured faintly to the space beside her on the bench. He crossed the room slowly, every step deliberate, like a man approaching a wild horse that might bolt, and when he lowered himself beside her, he left a hand's breadth of space, as though it were an altar between them. She could feel his presence, warm, solid, unthreatening, so close that for the first time she realized not all nearness carried danger. She dared to glance at him, and he kept his eyes lowered to the fire, waiting for her lead, and that restraint struck her deeper than any declaration could. Her voice trembled as she said, "It feels strange, but maybe not bad strange, maybe good strange." And in that small, halting admission, the walls she had built for survival began to shift, letting in a sliver of light. And I, Elias Redfeather, who have heard many tales whispered across this frontier, will tell you this. That night it wasn't a kiss, nor a touch, nor a promise of forever that mattered most. It was a woman daring to believe she was safe in another's nearness, and a man proving her belief true by asking nothing more. The night deepened. The fire burned low, and though she had not moved from her seat, something inside her had shifted, a trembling decision gathering like dawn on the horizon. He had kept his promise, never once letting his hand drift near hers, never letting his eyes demand more than she could give. And that quiet restraint became a language she had never known, one that spoke of safety instead of fear. She studied him in the glow of the embers, the scar at his temple, the rough calluses on his knuckles, the gentleness that lived in the space between his breaths. And she realized that for the first time she did not want distance to be her shield. Her fingers, trembling but determined, slipped from her lap and rested on the rough wood between them, just inches from his own hand, not touching but waiting. He noticed, she knew he did, but he did not move, not even a twitch of his fingers, and that patience became the very proof she needed. "You're different," she whispered, her voice breaking like a child's, and tears stung her eyes not from sorrow, but from the unfamiliar weight of hope. He finally turned his head, his gaze steady as the mountains beyond, and said, "Or maybe you're the one teaching me how to be the man I should have always been." At that, she did the unthinkable. She let the side of her hand brush against his, the faintest touch, so light it could have been a mistake, but it wasn't. And the moment it happened, her chest heaved like a dam breaking. He did not seize her hand or grip it with triumph. He simply let it rest there, still as stone, a quiet pillar beneath her trembling courage. She gasped once, half afraid she'd collapse under the storm of feelings, but then a strange calm filled her, as if for the first time her body was her own choice to give. And I, Elias Redfeather, must tell you, many stories of the frontier speak of battles and guns, but this night was a different kind of victory, when a woman scarred by silence reached across an unseen canyon and touched a man's hand, and in that smallest of gifts, she found the beginning of her healing. When morning came, pale gold light spilling through the cracks of the cabin walls, she woke not with terror clutching her chest, but with the memory of her hand resting against his, that fragile thread of contact that had carried her safely through the night. For a moment she feared it had all been a dream, that he might have taken advantage in her sleep, but when she turned her head, she found him sitting against the far wall, hat resting on his knee, watching the fire as though guarding her from the shadows. Her heart twisted because he had chosen discomfort so that she might sleep in peace, and that single act was louder than any declaration of love. Slowly, carefully, she rose from her blanket, her legs trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to do, and she crossed the floorboards until she stood just inches from him. He looked up, and though surprise flickered across his face, he did not move to close the space, waiting instead, steady as the earth. Her lips parted, and for the first time in her life, she whispered words without trembling. "I'm not afraid of you." Her voice cracked, but the truth in it filled the air like sunlight piercing a storm. His eyes softened, and he answered in a low tone, Then I'll spend my life making sure you never are." She lowered herself beside him, their shoulders brushing, and though no kiss passed between them, something deeper was sealed in that quiet cabin. A vow unspoken yet stronger than any marriage paper. I, Elias Redfeather, tell you this was not the end of their tale, but the beginning of a life where touch would one day become trust, and trust would become love, built not by force, but by the courage of two wounded hearts who chose each other. And so, in the year 1872, when so many stories ended in silence or shame, theirs began with a whisper and a promise, a frontier vow that carried them into forever. That night, with the prairie stretched endlessly beyond the cabin and 1,000 stars burning like watchful eyes above them, Miriam sat by the fire while Caleb returned from tending the horses, his hands roughened with work but his face gentled by thought, and he lowered himself beside her with a quiet gravity that seemed to hush even the crickets in the grass. And after a silence too long to bear, he spoke in the kind of voice that comes when a man is laying down his very soul, telling her how once, years ago, he had touched someone too harshly in anger. Not a woman, but a brother in arms when whiskey clouded his judgment, and how he swore never again to use his strength for harm. And that vow had left him walking carefully through the world, half afraid he might still break what was fragile, until the day he met her, and realized his vow was not meant to keep him away from gentleness, but to prepare him for it, because he had needed someone who carried scars like hers to remind him that tenderness is not weakness, but redemption. And as his words spilled raw and unpolished, she trembled, not from fear, but from the dawning weight of his truth. And she looked at her own hands, the ones she had always hidden as if they were stained by shame, and saw them shaking in the firelight until Caleb reached out, not to take them but to offer his palms open, waiting as if she could place her burdens there. And with a breath that broke like glass she did, resting her fingers inside his larger ones, the tremor running from her heart into his steadiness. And he whispered then, not as a man claiming or demanding, but as one surrendering, "If you let me hold your heart, Miriam, I will never let it fall." And in that moment the years of fear, the cries in the night, the flinches and the shame began to loosen their grip on her spirit, not gone yet, but breaking. And Elias Redfeather, your teller of this tale, must say here that I have walked many roads of the frontier, heard many stories told at firesides and in saloons, but few have struck me as deeply as the sight of a broken soul daring to believe again. For it is in such daring that the West itself found its fiercest strength. Morning light spilled over the hills like gold poured from the heavens, painting the cabin walls and brushing Miriam's face with warmth as she stirred from sleep, her head resting against Caleb's shoulder, where she had, for the first time in her life, slept without fear of sudden hands or cruel voices. And when she blinked awake, she found him already watching her with a quiet reverence that made her chest ache. For it was not desire in his gaze, but the kind of devotion that asked for nothing yet promised everything. And she whispered hoarsely, "I don't deserve this." But he answered without hesitation, "You deserve more than I'll ever be able to give." And the words struck deeper than any embrace, because they told her she was not a burden. Not a broken thing, but the very treasure he had prayed for in silence. So she rose slowly, barefoot on the wooden floor, and turned to face him with trembling lips, as if at last she would test the promise he had made beneath the stars. And she reached for his hand, placing it gently against her chest where her heart thundered, and whispered, "You said you'd hold it. Then take it now." And Caleb's breath caught, his hand spreading across her as though steadying not just her heart but her whole life. And when his forehead pressed to hers, she did not flinch. For the first time she leaned in, her lips finding his, soft and new, and the kiss was not fire or frenzy, but a sacred sealing of all the wounds they had carried. And when she drew back, her eyes wet, she whispered, "I'm not afraid any more." And his arms enfolded her, not to claim but to keep, wrapping her in the home she thought she would never have. And outside the cabin the West stretched on, wild and untamed, but within those walls peace had finally been carved out of pain. And now, as your storyteller Elias Redfeather, I close this tale, reminding you that it was set in the hard years of the 1870s, when the frontier tested every soul. Yet even there, amid dust and sorrow, two broken hearts proved that gentleness is the bravest strength of all. And so it was, and so it shall be remembered. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If someone once promised to hold your heart gently, would you have dared to believe them? Tell us in the comments.